Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress and welcome to today's webinar, Demystifying DevExpress Charts, presented by DevExpress Technical Evangelist Paul Usher and DevExpress CTO Julian Bucknall. In this session, you'll learn how to get started with charts, how to choose the best chart type for the job, the anatomy of a chart, how to prepare data for optimal results in non-standard data sources, and the DevExpress Chart Wizard. This presentation will cover WinForms and ASP.NET controls as well as charts in reports and dashboards. All right, so this session is being recorded and it will be made available on our DevExpress YouTube channel later today. We will also do a live Q&A at the end of this presentation. Just type your questions in the GoToWebinar control panel at any time throughout the broadcast. All right, thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Paul and Julian.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation. Bonjour, Julian.
Hey, bonjour, Paul. Hey, bonjour tout le monde. Yes, I've just come back from a nice little vacation in Paris, so I am going to be speaking French, and Paul is going to be going, what?
Comment ça va?
Oh, très bien, merci. Et toi?
That's the extent of my French, so we're done now.
So moving right along. Yes, welcome everybody, and we must, I think, offer some apologies for the delay in this particular webinar.
So apologies for you going on vacation. No, seriously. I was traveling on the last prescribed date, and the connectivity where I was just unusable, so I do apologize, and then of course you were away, so it's our first opportunity to get back together and talk about charts.
Absolutely. Starting from the beginning.
Now just notice, Julian, your volume has gone a little bit quieter than before, so
oh, I do apologize. Let me move this microphone
better.
There we are.
So today's agenda, we're going to start by having a quick charts primer and then look at the DevExpress charts, the anatomy of a chart, and build a couple of demos. And at the end of all that, I'm going to get you to do the question and answer section.
Lovely.
That works?
Yeah, je suis prêt.
Now we do have some of the engineering team on the call, so feel free to add your questions at any time, and they will get to it, and Julian will recap some. One of the things with charts is it's such a big element to our control set. It touches a lot of different things, as you'll see. So it's going to be quite an interesting time to see what questions come in. Julian, I'm going to throw that question out to you and ask you, when I mention the word chart, what do you think about?
So a chart, well, let's start afresh. I've got a mathematics background, did mathematics at university, and we used to talk about graphs. And charts are more business-oriented graphs, if you like. So it's a 2D representation of some kind of data. So the data essentially has two coordinates. We have an X coordinate and a Y coordinate, and we're going to be plotting those data points on a 2D surface, like your screen, for example. Back in my day, we used to have graph paper. So we'd actually plot our graphs. We would draw our x-axis and draw our y-axis, and then plot, I don't know, say the graph of the sine function. And back in the day, I used to have a bendy ruler as well. So we'd plot all the points on the graph paper, and then we'd use our bendy ruler to go through all those points and then be able to draw a line, which was the chart. These days, obviously, it's all computerized. 2D charts display nicely on the screen. We also have the ability to do 3D charts where essentially you're projecting the 3D aspect with X, Y, and Z axes onto a 2D surface, which is the screen. And obviously with 3D charts, you tend to need the ability to have some kind of interactivity, so you can rotate the chart a little bit or zoom in on particular areas and things like that. So a chart is a visual representation of some data, and the reason we use it is to glean the underlying information in that data. Yes, we can display the data as a table, but you don't get any information, any understanding out of that table of data points. The chart gives you a nice, it goes back to the old adage of a picture is worth 1,000 words. In our case, a chart is worth 1,000 points. You get more information out of it. You see trends. You see how data varies across a set of arguments and so on and so forth.
Cool. Now you did mention 2D and as you said 3D, so if we're dealing with 3D charts we've got to be able to rotate, do things like that. So we'll see some examples of those as we go through. A couple of quick points. When we talk certain types of charts, so I might say histogram or bar chart, it's another man's column chart. So we've got to be careful that in some cases we're referencing a specific name or type and it could be known as something else for people.
Right.
Now, one of the things, as I was doing the research for this session, I came across an infographic, which we're going to start with today, because sometimes as developers, not all of us had the fortune to go through the maths doctorates and degrees and all those things. And for some of us, it's just brute force rather than being as smart as you are. But I think one of the things it comes down to is when a client comes along, I want to produce a chart. Where do I start? And the thing I found most interesting was it can be dragged into one starting point, one question, and that is, what would you like to show? In other words, given the data that you've been asked to do something with, what do you want to do with it? And that can be broken into 4 distinct areas. There's comparison, distribution, relationship, and composition. What I'm going to do is spend just a couple of minutes going through each of those different areas and how that can take you down a path of other sub-questions to try and help you choose the correct chart for the correct data set or what you're wanting to actually represent. We'll start with comparison. Now, just the word itself has a meaning of consideration or estimate between similarities or dissimilarities between many or multiple things. And depending on the number of things would help you determine what kind of chart you want to use. You can see from this breakdown, you may want to compare items against items, and it may be over time. And then there's a consideration of quantities. So we can see if it was among items, we then can ask, is it 2 variables per item or 1 variable per item? If it's 1, is it broken down into many categories or few categories? And by following that trend, you can say, well, okay, if it's 1 variable, few categories, and many items, then a bar chart may be suitable versus a column chart for few items. If you're looking to do a comparison or compare values over time, again, depending on whether we're talking about many periods or a few periods, we could select things like cyclical data, which we cover inside our radar and polar charts, all the way through to the likes of a line chart, being few periods, many categories. If you're looking to the relationship of data, so where you want to see how data is connected on or in relation to other data points, then you may consider using a scatter chart where you've just got a couple of variables. Or if there's more variables, such as 3, you do something like a bubble chart. Now, interestingly, Julian talked about 2D information here. A bubble chart's a great example of being able to look at almost a third dimension of data in a straight 2D or flat aspect, where we might have time across the x-axis, value up on the y-axis, and then another element such as size or complexity actually represented by the size of the bubble.
The big issue with bubble chart actually shows that we as human beings can't really estimate areas very well. We see here on this little diagram that we have, big bubbles and we have little bubbles, but we can't estimate what the value of the area of those bubbles are. So I would recommend that if you're going to represent some kind of data, some kind of value, I should say, as a bubble, do not expect your end users to be able to estimate the actual value rather than just this is bigger than that. It's very, very difficult to estimate areas.
Way to burst my bubble, Julian.
Indeed. So, if it's just, as you pointed out, some kind of complexity metric, for example, then yes, it's we can say, okay, big bubble means very complex, small bubble means not very complex. And we can just basically say, yeah, this bubble is bigger than that bubble. But we can't estimate an actual value out of that bubble. So just be aware that representing values as areas, actually, I should have pointed that out on the previous set of charts you showed up there, the variable width column chart, very hard to read. You see that the first item up there on the top left. Very hard to read. Essentially, it's asking the user to estimate an area. So be aware. Bar charts are easy because it's just the length. Is this longer than that one? Yes, it is. Is it twice as long? Yeah, pretty much. Areas, kind of hard.
Excellent. So if we consider distribution next, the way something is shared among a group or over an area. And again, depending on the number of data points that you're going to deal with as to the use, whether it's a simple column histogram, a line, a scatter chart, or all the way through to that 3D area chart. And you can see just from the graphic here how it looks for the X, Y, and Z axis, Z, depending where you're from.
And the 3D area chart, again, to get the best information out of a 3D area chart or a 3D chart anyway, is to have some kind of interactivity. You've got to look around it. You can't just see the actual information for a chart just by looking at it from a 2D aspect, from a projection onto your eyes. You have to look around. You have to be able to see behind and all that kind of stuff.
And finally, we've got composition. Now, composition is the combining of distinct parts to make a whole. You'll see here that this is the only element where we've got one of my favorite chart types, the pie chart, which when you think about it contains 100% of the components and is simply broken up into sub-segments or sections to represent different things. I'm going to not let Julian jump in just yet because he does not like pie charts. We can see from the stacked 100% column chart all the way through to the stacked 100% column chart with the subcomponents that we're talking about a whole and reporting or charting on that whole as a value. Now, Julian, you can share why you don't like pie charts.
Pie charts is an example of having to estimate areas, essentially. Here you're having to estimate an angle rather than a length. Estimating angles, again, is hard. If you imagine a pie chart with lots of segments, is that angle roughly the same as that one? Yeah, maybe. Is it a quarter? Maybe it's a quarter. I don't know. So I tend to find with pie charts, you having to label each of the pies anyway, because you can't estimate the actual angle. And we'll see that in a moment when you show some examples. And the pie chart at that particular point in time becomes, smaller and smaller because your labels get bigger and bigger. I prefer line charts or bar charts to a pie chart.
But I think to be fair to the humble pie chart, in some cases it's a quick visual representation as to, hey, this is doing better than that.
Yeah, indeed. If you have a small number of pies, I'm thinking,
call you the pie man.
I'm thinking of going down to the grocery store and buying some pies. No, a small number of slices of pie, then yeah, okay, you can get some valuable information of viewing a pie chart. If you have more than, say, 5 slices, it's getting a lot more difficult. If you have 10 or 20 slices, you don't get really any information at all.
So it still comes back to that fundamental question, what information are you wanting to show? Exactly. And I just found that this great little graphic was able to explain to the non-mathematician or to the layperson, that is a great way to start.
Indeed.
So let's now talk about DevExpress Charts. And my next question to you, Julian, is name all the platforms that charts are used in.
Well, it's pretty simple. We provided a charting library for pretty much every single platform that we support. So WinForms, ASP.NET, ASP.NET MVC, WPF, UWP, and of course, pure client-side charting for web applications with DevExtreme. They all have a charting library, some with more charts than others, but definitely.
You failed to mention Silverlight.
Oh,
Thankfully.
we don't talk about Silverlight anymore.
And of course, there's reporting and dashboards to consider as well. Now, the reporting product and the dashboard product would both use the underlying charting library from either WinForms or from ASP.NET, depending on which flavor you're using. But it is there to note that charting is available inside both of those products. Obviously dashboards, you'd expect it, but there's some great things happening with charts inside reports as well. The other thing you just mentioned, and I want to point that out, is that not all the chart types are available for all of the platforms. So please be mindful of that when you look at some of the examples. Just as a quick heads up on the different chart types, WinForms has the largest selection of all the platforms. I'm not going to read all these names out. You can get this information from our website, etc. Some of these charts are going to look really familiar to you. Other ones, such as the polar point or the scatter radar line, you might think, what on earth, are we back in the 70s with our little, what was it you called it?
Spirograph. Does anybody remember the Spirograph toy where you had these gears within gears and you put your pen inside the hole and you moved it around and draw these wonderful little curves? It's just...
Many a page wasted.
Indeed.
Now, interestingly, we've had this debate, but radar, area, line and point, I'd love anybody that's on the call or anybody that's watching this on our YouTube channel later on, just to drop us a quick line if they're using any of that style of chart and in what sense or what scenario, because it really has me intrigued. I mean, financial charts you can understand, like the stock chart, obviously donuts, pies, funnel. I know you're not a big fan of the funnel chart, but they at least seem to have a direct relationship to something in business. So the others I'd love to hear about. We've then got the 3D types, and we can see that some of these charts are just 3D representations of their 2D counterparts. So the donut, the pie, just gives you a 3D-ish version, just added some depth and some rendering. Whereas charts like the Manhattan bar and even the spline give you a real sense of the data that you're looking at. You get this beautiful representation, and given the fact that you can zoom in and rotate, and as you were saying, the Manhattan bar is a great example of wanting to just grab it and rotate it and look at what's behind some of the other bar or towers, etc.
Exactly. The Manhattan bar is an excellent example of the fact that you need some kind of interactivity with 3D charts. You have to be able to look behind and to see relationships by rotating the chart and so on and so forth. It's an excellent example of that kind of thing. Whereas okay, a 3D donut chart, yeah, okay.
So WPF has a lot of the same chart types, and in fact, if I think back to our 16.1 presentation, there was a particular chart type that you were showing off there that is still only available in WPF. So it had the rendering engine available, and I think it's still sitting as that example. So we've got some 2D chart types and some 3D chart types, and the same for ASP.NET and ASP.NET MVC. Now, when it comes to DevExtreme, the chart control itself, I'm just going to jump to the DevExtreme website here. You can jump in and start looking at the actual chart control. Not all of the charts have yet been ported over or written for the lightweight client-side library, but what is there is really quite impressive. And one of the things I love about the DevExtreme website here with the demos is that you get to see exactly how to implement each of the different ways, so whether you're using jQuery or Angular or if you're using AngularJS versus Angular, we won't even go into that naming convention, or even down to ASP.NET Core, you can see how to build the chart and what you'd need to do to implement that. And you can see all the different examples of the charts here. So we've got the line and point charts, the financial series. So in actual fact, there's a lot more than the last time I played with the charts in here. So the team are doing a stellar job there.
Indeed, and the nice thing about the JavaScript or DevExtreme side of things is you can play around with them on our site. They are, after all, for web applications. So go in your browser, play around with the demos, and see what happens when you change. And the nice thing about DevExtreme, you can actually change the code, so you can see what happens when you change the code and see how the chart changes and all that, and the interactivity and all that.
Which is nice. Now, whether you're an experienced DevExpress user or you're new to the teams, there's always somewhere to get more information. So if you're looking at WinForms WPF, then you can use the Demo Center, which is installed with the products. So you can launch the Demo Center, jump into the charts demo, and you can start looking at some of the things that's available. You can get into the chart designer from here. Look at the real time. So there's just lots to get to know some of the functionality and features without having to start opening Visual Studio. If you're dealing with ASP.NET, MVC, or the lightweight stuff, as we mentioned, you can look at all that online. So that means even less work for you to do. Just browse to our site and start clicking through. And if you're more interested in reporting and dashboards, then again, you can do that from the Demo Center. So that's where you can get started. Now we're going to spend a couple of minutes talking about the anatomy of a chart. Both previously and as we move forward, we're going to be using words, data points, series, axes, legends, grid lines, all sorts of things. And certainly if you're new to charting, some of it can be confusing, especially around data points and series and even axes. So we're just going to spend a few minutes going through each of those elements, and then we'll get into some actual demonstrations.
In fact, I'd like to reinforce that the issue I found when I started using our charting products to demonstrate them or whatever was the terminology involved. And once you nail down the terminology, charts become a lot easier to use. You understand where the options are, what the options do, and so on and so forth. So I think once you have that understanding of the terminology that we're using within charting, I mean, obviously in mathematics, it's like coordinates, x coordinate, y coordinate, and so on and so forth. Once you understand the terminology, it becomes easier to understand how to use charts and how to visually represent some kind of data.
The other thing to maybe point out here as well, Julian, is when anybody's ever come to me and said, hey, I want to do this type of chart in my application, I've asked them to produce it in Excel for me, where I can see the raw data and then actually have them produce the chart in Excel. And if you can do that, you can translate that very, very quickly over to our products,
Right.
as opposed to coming it cold and wondering where you're supposed to get started.
Right.
One of the most fundamental elements to a chart is a data point. Now, you cannot plot anything on the screen unless you have at least one data point. But a group of data points, which would make more sense, represents a single series. You cannot display a chart until you have at least one series, which of course makes sense as well. We can see here from this graphic that we've got two series represented. We've got a line series, which represents the value at 2001, and we can see the actual bar chart itself, or the bar series representing data from 2004, which is both are going across the x-axis with states. If we translate that into actual data, we can see that the argument going across the axis of argument, and I'll cover axes shortly, is a state. It's a straight string value, and it's represented in the form of a bar chart. Whereas the actual value, which is rendered on the axis of values, is some dollar figure from selling something or wherever the data came from. But you can clearly see that the 528 value is rendered just above the 500 line, etc. So we've got a clear distinction between argument and value. And this represents a single series.
Indeed. So the argument axis is the x-axis if you come from mathematics background, and the value axis is the y-axis. So for each argument, you have a value. And as you see in the table there, each argument has a value, and then we plot it as a bar chart, as in this example. The interesting thing about business charts versus mathematics charts is the x-axis doesn't actually have to be a numeric value. Here we have values essentially which are strings. So we can't compare the strings in any meaningful sense in a chart. They're just there as points of the chart.
So separators along the x-axis.
Yeah, indeed.
Now if we take that one step further, we may want to have multiple values per argument. So we're going to introduce multiple series. Again, we can see we've got state being the argument, and then we've got a separate set of values for each of the years represented in this data set, 98, 2001, 2004. And you can see that on the chart, the legend, so this thing over here, clearly indicates the color per series, whereas the information, again by state, and we've got the value for each of those series. And it wouldn't take much at all when you were building this chart to instead group by state. You could actually set the argument by year and have the state as the series type, which is just another way of seeing the same data slightly differently.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked a lot about axes. Now, Julian did point out that the y-axis would be known as your axis of value, and the x-axis would be your axis of argument. Years ago, I would get confused as to which was which, x going which way, y going which way. And somebody shared with me the simple thing to think about is x is represented by a cross. So therefore the x-axis goes across. It's the horizontal axis. And that always stuck with me, so I didn't have to go to all the trouble of getting my math diploma. I just remember that.
Indeed.
And
so
I do find the English extremely interesting here, Julian. We talk of axes with IS, but multiple are axes.
Yes, you pronounce it slightly differently. Yes. Axes versus axis, yes.
Now, most charts use two axes as represented here, and it demonstrates probably one of the most popular diagram types, which is the XY diagram or the Cartesian diagram. And I love the word Cartesian.
Cartesian comes from René Descartes, so it's my
we went back
French
to
for now.
French. Julian, I think we should open an office in Paris and send you there.
I'll be right there. Yep, absolutely.
Now, there's sometimes a need for multiple y-axes. You can see in this example that we've got two series. One series has got a value from 21 to 40, and the second series has got values from 125 to 1700. So by introducing that secondary y-axis, we can clearly show both sets of information without losing any fidelity on that chart.
If you look at the previous chart, just step back, this is the same data represented using one y-axis. And as you see, the blue line, you can't get any information out of that blue line at all. It looks a little higher at the A than it does at the C, but you have no way of visually understanding how different it is. Whereas if you go back to the double or the secondary y-axis there, you have a more visual representation, a better understanding of how things are changing as you move from A to G. A to G, some kind of arguments there, but at least you have some way of showing that, the yellow line or the orange line changes by dropping drastically, but the blue line doesn't drop as drastically. So you have some kind of visual understanding there of that information.
I think this was the sales of Apple products in the last 6 months here, Julian.
The yellow line is the sales of the MacBook Pro or something like that. Whatever they've
Yes.
just replaced or whatever.
All right, moving right along. So now let's take a quick look at the objects behind some of these charts and how they represented on the actual canvas, so to speak. So starting with a simple diagram, and by simple I mean the likes of a pie chart. We can see that inside the chart control we've got a number of elements, so series diagram, titles, annotations and legend. Behind series you've got series points, which can also house annotations, the labels and the titles. So translated into an actual diagram, we can see that where the title sits, the annotation, and each of those subsets.
Indeed, and this is the example of a pie chart where, okay, you have to actually show the data with the chart. You can't read the angle, you can't estimate the angle from the the individual slices or whatever. You actually have to display the percentage.
The ongoing battle here, Julian, for me would be I would look at the pie, look at the segment that would interest me, then go to the label. I wouldn't be looking to read every label. So I still think it's useful.
Okay.
Moving right along, we've got the Cartesian or XY diagram. And we can see straight away that it's a lot more complicated or has a lot more behind it as far as what's going to be drawn. The example attached to this one, we can see has got multiple panes. We're using a financial chart here, so look how terrible the Australian dollar is against the American. Anyway, the different axes, the multiple panes, we've got strips, tick marks indicated, and there's just a lot more can be presented on that particular diagram. And then finally, the radar or polar diagrams. Not quite as complicated in terms of the objects sitting behind the chart control. If we bring this little example up, now Julian and I have been debating as well, which is why I asked the question before, where you would actually use this type of diagram. Julian feels that the temperature in London could be plotted much easier on a line chart.
In essence, what we're showing here is, okay, after December you get January, so it's cyclical. Whereas in a line chart, you go from January to December. To be honest, I get more information, if you like, out of a Cartesian plot than a radar plot. But that's just me. Maybe I just don't like circles, which is why I don't like pie charts. I don't know.
Radar plots are good for tracking flights.
Yes.
All right, let's jump over to Visual Studio now and take a look at some of these things actually in practice. I've got two quick demos to do. The first one I'm going to do is on aggregation. I'm dealing with a Windows project right now. You can do this as well on some of the other platforms. So the first thing to do is find the chart component and add that to the canvas. By default, the chart designer will pop up. There's a little option here to actually say do this, or you can turn it off and say don't annoy me as often. So I'm just going to remove that for a second. I'm going to use a smart tag to dock inside the parent container, which is always good. One of the things we wanted to show in this presentation was the fact that the chart controls have got a wide range of data sources that are available to them. So the first thing I want to do in this one is actually add the Excel data source into my project as well. So I'm going to bring that in, and I'm going to select just a quick Excel spreadsheet that the team very kindly provided for me, and select next. At this point I can leave all these standard settings. It's saying, do I want to have the first row as field names? I say yes. It's picked up the fact that I've got three columns. I don't need to do anything there, but I will just preview my data. And this is a CSV of currency information between...
So it's exchange rate information between euro and dollar, and way, way, way down below is between pound sterling and dollar. So it's basically date and the exchange rate for each of those two conversions. So be aware there are two series here, one euro to dollar, the other one sterling to dollar.
So the next thing I want to do now is actually choose the data source wizard on the chart. So I've selected the smart tag and I choose data source wizard, and from the list of available data sources I'm going to choose the Excel data source, and it's already found the fact that there is an Excel data source 1 available in here. I could have done it the other way, come down to Excel and created the data source that way. It's one way or the other. When I choose next, I want the binding to be done via the binding source component, and then I don't need to see the code behind, and I want the series to be created based on currency.
So the currency column defines the two series that we're going to be using. It's one big table with two series, and that's what we're going to do. Now, the other thing about the designer here is it's using fake data. Although we've defined the Excel data source, it does not at design time, I should say, show the data from that data source. So it assumes you're going to be using 3 series and so on and so forth.
And that's something that's really quite important, as we'll see with this and the next demonstration. It can be confusing if you're looking to make changes and you see this doesn't actually represent what is in your live data source. Okay, I'm now inside my designer and I want to go to my data tab. Now there's a lot going on inside the designer, and everything that you click on is going to alter what is available inside things like the options and the properties window. So if I come down to the diagram itself, I'm going to get a different set of properties to if I'm sitting up on the chart. It's one thing to be really, really careful of. It is nice the fact that you can actually limit what you're looking for using the search engine, and of course it's broken down into categories as well. So are you looking to change things to do with the appearance, with the behavior, etc., etc. If you could take one tip away from today, it would be careful what you've got selected, and don't be afraid to start looking and playing through some of these things. A lot of the options are also related to the chart type. So if you're choosing a pie chart and you start looking for crosshairs and things like that, it just doesn't make sense. But of course the components are so, I was going to say complex, but they're complex in terms of what goes on under the hood to provide such a rich user experience for your end user. I'm going to jump across to the data tab. Again, it's telling me that I'm binding I'm bound to my Excel binding source. The series is currency. We've already set that up when we did that before. And I'm going to choose an argument of date. So argument, of course, being the x-axis, I'm learning, and the value, or my y-axis, will be value.
And notice again that the chart being displayed there has no relationship to the actual data. So those dates are just made up on the spur of the moment, and the value on the x-axis from 0 to 10.5, yeah, just made up.
Just made up. Okay. Now, what have I gone and done here, Julian?
I don't know. Where are you? Auto-created series? No?
Yeah, I'm in my auto-created series. So at this point, I want to change my view from bar charts because that would make no sense, and I want to go to line. That makes more sense since we're looking at currency data. And then the other thing I want to do, if I come down to the XY diagram, and this is what I was saying before, it really depends on where you're at inside this properties grid as to what you're going to do here. So I want to enable scrolling on both the X and Y axes, and then on my primary X axis I want to add interlaced in as well. So what I'm going to do now is hit OK to commit those, and I'm going to run. This is
So
one
in
of the things we
essence,
love
yeah.
about live presentations.
So in essence, there are an awful lot of data points here in this series. So we get the ability, as you see, it's very jagged. There's a lot of data here. So it makes sense in that kind of situation to be able to zoom in on the chart, as Paul is doing now. And so you can see trends over a shorter period of time versus the trends over a longer period of time. And the interlacing basically gives you a nice way of partitioning up the years, and depending on the zoom factor, how many years that is, or the period of time that is.
All right, so because there's such a lot of data, one of the things I can do is actually change the way that that is aggregated. So I'm going to come back to the designer. I'm going to come back into the primary x-axis and go to properties. And I've now got my date time scale options. At the moment, well, we'll leave the scale as average, but we're going to set the scale mode to automatic. I'm going to hit OK to commit those changes and run that same sample.
So what's going to happen here is the jaggedness is going to disappear depending on the x-axis range, if you like. So as you zoom in, you remove the jaggedness essentially, so you see a kind of average of the data for each period of time. And zooming in, you get more of the data being displayed.
And of course, not to mention the other thing here of that comparison, or the point line being drawn between as I move through it. It makes it really easy to look at the values of both of those series at the same time. We've got the tooltip popping up. So I think there's some nice functionality that at this stage we've not done any programming for. So
Yep.
we can bring all that straight out. And so there's a lot of user interactivity in the charts. Of course, if it was a 3D chart that we'd used, it would automatically support things like the rotation as well as zoom.
Right.
Now the second demo that I want to do is going to be a drill down. Again, all I've got here is a project. I'll set a startup so I don't forget. And we've got a blank canvas. Now this one is going to involve a bit of typing, so anything goes.
We shall see.
I'm working on my HP today, which is really good because I shared with Julian before my mouse isn't working, and so trying to show you zoom on a touchpad is really quite tricky, but I was able to pinch the screen, which I can't do on a MacBook. Again, I'm going to start by docking this into the parent, and this time I'm going to say that I want to create a new data source. I'm going to go through it this way just to show you something different. Add a project data source. I'm going to go with a database, and I'm going to create a new connection, browse through to an Access database of all things.
Yep.
One of the cool things using Access databases for demos, when we provide the source code, we can wrap it in there. You don't have to worry about having SQL Server on your machine and other things. So here's a connection. This is just asking if I want to move that database into my my local project folder because it's noted that it's somewhere else. I'm going to say yes. And here we've got a table. I'm going to go to GSP and finish. So we've now got all the necessary bindings inside there and we're ready to go. Next thing I want to do is invoke the designer again. And this time I'm going to add two series. So I'm just going to go manual and just quickly add two series. Choosing series 1, I'm going to do the unthinkable and change the view to pi. I know you love it. And then moving across to the data tab, I can set up the actual elements here. So I want my argument, in this case, to be region, and I want my value to be GSP. And because it's a simple diagram, there's many things I need to do. Argument and GSP.
So GSP is a gross state product So the argument is, in fact, the state or the region, if you like. So here we are. We're just going to show a simple 2D plot of each region and the gross state product for that particular region.
So what I need to do now is use the summary function, and I just need to resize this box slightly thanks to my DPI, and I'm going to choose sum, and I want the sum to be on the GSP. And we're done with the pie chart effectively.
So in essence, what's happened, or what we've done, is there is an awful lot of data of value or dollar value over years, over regions, and we've basically summed for each region the dollar value, the gross dollar value, the sum of the gross dollar values.
Now, I've selected Series 2. I don't want you to get confused because it's still sitting as a bar chart. Okay, so I'm in Series 2. So as far as my options, my properties, and my data go, I'm now working on that bar chart. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set the argument to be year and the value to be GSP.
So what we're aiming to do here is the pie chart shows you value for each region, and we want to click on a slice of the pie chart and see the actual data for each region. So the data per year, the dollar value per year for each region. That's what we're aiming for.
Correct. So the pie is going to give us a sum for all of the years by region. So it's combining, doing a sum of all the series, and then we want to drill down into a region and see a bar chart showing those years. Now what I need to do here is add a data filter. I'm going to add, and the column name is going to be year. No, it's going to be region, because that's what I'm going to filter on. Makes sense, doesn't it? And that's all I need to do at that point, is just add that filter. I'm then going to come down to titles, and I'm going to quickly add a title. The chart title, I was having trouble with my keyboard earlier, but we're going to say back to region view, and we'll just move that so it's sitting on the left-hand side. So we're going to use that as a bit of a navigation tool for our sub-elements. And the other thing I want to do is just turn the visibility of that chart title off, so it's off by default. As far as setting up the chart, I've set up my two different series, or my two charts, the way that I want, and now it's time to do a little bit of code behind. So I don't want to jump to the code behind just yet, because I want to bring up the property window, come across to the events, and find the object selected. And here we have object selected, so I can double click. And this is not a lesson on best coding practices, because I'm going to stick a variable here, or of course one would put it at the top normally, but we're going to call this region view, and we're going to say that as a default it is true. And I'm going to work with two methods. I'm going to say initialize region view, which doesn't take any parameters, and I want a method which is initialize year view, which is going to need to take something in, which would be a series point, not a series point as much as I'd like one right now, and series point, 4 o'clock in the morning, probably too early.
Yeah, a little bit.
I can resolve the library issue there like so. So what do I want to do? Well, when an object is selected, first thing I want to do is say, okay, I'm dealing with series, and I want it to then say E being the element being passed in, object, and we're going to say try and cast that as series. So if it is a series, we're going to get a value or an object. If it's not, then we're not. Make sense?
Yep,
so
absolutely.
So we can say,
I just want to point out here, if you think about it, a chart is a set of objects being displayed. There's a chart, yes, but there's also things like the legend, the title, and all that kind of stuff. Each of those is a separate object. So you can click on anything within the chart diagram, and this event is going to get fired. And all we're doing here is to say, well, if you actually clicked on one of the series, then we can do something. If you didn't, then yeah, we're going to do something else, and so on and so forth.
So what we've basically said is if you've clicked on the series, then we want to initialize the series view, passing in the additional information as a series point into this new method. And otherwise, we want to look at saying, well, is the object chart title? And if title is not equal to null, so again, we know that at this point we've got a chart title.
Right.
So the keyboard skills coming through.
Clicked on the chart title. So here we are. We're going to do something else. We're going to initialize the region view.
The region view. So sitting inside those two methods, we've got the region view, which is simply going to say, okay, region view is true. And then we're going to say, update the chart control series. We know that series 0 is our region series. We're going to make sure that it's visible. And then one of the things we want to do is turn the export to image. Yeah, that'd be a good thing to do. Let's turn title element 0. We only have one title, and we'll turn its visibility to false. Now, this is one of the cool default Boolean properties that we have. If we're inside the use view, then I want to say region view is false. And bring back VB, Julian.
You need a bigger keyboard, I think. That HP is a little small.
I just need smaller fingers. This time we're going to turn series 0, visible is going to be false. And what we want to do is update the data filter. So it's going to be the series 1. You remember we created that data filter?
Yep, indeed.
Data filters, and there's only one data filter, so we're going to go with element 0 inside that collection. I'm going to say the value is equal to series point dot, and you will see that we actually have an argument inside there. Let's try that again. Argument that we can pass through. And then the final thing we want to do is then say chart control 1 dot title titles 0 dot visible.
So in essence, what we're doing here is turning off one series to display the other series, having determined that the user has clicked on a pie slice.
Correct. And with all of that, it's still built, so we're good. And run, and then we can get into some questions. But here we've got our chart, we've got our regions. I haven't updated the labels and things, but there's our regions represented in GSP, and if I click on an element, I've now got the breakdown of years for, or values per year for that, and I can click back to the region view and drill down to something else to get a different view.
And obviously, as Paul said, we haven't done any changes to the labels. We haven't done any changes to the grid underlying the chart. So it's all a bit, bare bones at the moment. But at least it shows that to implement some kind of drill down, it's fairly easy stuff. And
dealing with the
afterwards is pretty simple.
Yep, we're dealing with the object selected event, and then we have a couple of events to do that. Obviously, you'd have to add different checking, make sure that your types are coming through, and you could do lots more visually to clean that up. But given our time constraint, we have a drill down.
Okay.
We're at the top of the hour.
No, we've got about 5 more minutes. Amanda, we started. Yeah.
Hey guys. Yeah, we did start a little bit late. We do have several questions that did come in. Let's see, from Patrick, is the chart designer also available in WPF?
I thought Julian was answering the question.
Cricket.
To be honest, yes.
Of course
yes,
it is.
Isn't it? Yes.
looking for my demo center. So next question while I jump in here.
Sure. Let's see. When do you think you might release the WPF 3D line chart? From Michael.
That's a Julian question.
I have absolutely no idea. At this present point in time, what happens is, as you probably saw right from the beginning, we implement a lot of things in WinForms first and then migrate them to WPF, or vice versa. It's hard to say individual chart types. It's hard to say. It depends on the amount of feedback we get from people, the amount of questions we get about it, requests, suggestions, and so on and so forth. So best bet is to go to the support center, see whether you can find somebody asking the same question and, tag it and say, yes, I want that too.
How can we load large data without date time scaling, like average, max, min, etc.? And by large data, I mean greater than 10 million data points.
Question I would ask, Julian, as you answer this one is, how can you represent, given current screens, etc., 10 million data points? What are you wanting to actually do with that data?
That's a good point. Your screen is what? Well, what's this screen? It's like 2,000 pixels across or something. Yeah.
Should you be shaping the data on the way in?
Yeah. We have various methods to actually display charts using a lot of data points. I am not, unfortunately, familiar with them. Again, it's a support type question. Large data source.
I mean, there's
go for the million.
There's a million. But as we saw with the averaging that we applied on that other chart as well. So good question. I mean, if we can get some context around what you're wanting to do as far as 10 million points on one chart.
Yeah, I replied. We'll see if he pops back in. From Patrick, I have a GIS application showing geoterrain path profiles. For that, I am using a chart control with roughly 10 series controls. The series may have thousands of points. Can you address performance issues and also how to save a chart with so many points?
That's a support center question. No way can I answer that off the cuff.
From Michael, the drill down example you showed at the end, does that always require code changes, or is it possible to achieve that using the dashboard designer only?
You can do drill down in dashboard without any code whatsoever. The one we showed there was just using the raw chart control inside an application. But the dashboard designer does have drill through and filtering.
Okay, let's see. You showed a bar chart earlier. Is the data already formatted in the table? For example, the chart can't take a bunch of raw data and format it into what you want to produce.
You've got to pass the data in as, in essence, as an argument and a value. You're not going to, the chart needs to know which column or which row represents what. You can certainly apply any of the functions, being sums or averages or things like that, to large raw data, but your data source needs to have some form of structure to it.
That bar chart was based upon a CSV file. So the CSV file was string data separated by commas, and we're basically reading that CSV file and converting the string data into numeric values. That's what the chart, or rather the data source, is doing for you. But as Paul says, it's in essence, the CSV data is regular in appearance. So each row of the CSV data is three items. The first item being it was the currency exchange values, the euro to dollar thing, and then the second one was the date, and the third one was the actual exchange rate. If you threw in a few rows with extra data on it, or missing data or something like that, the data source is not going to be able to cope. So your data has to be regular to a certain extent, I would say.
Can you also change a pie to a bar chart in the dashboard designer?
You can set multiple different styles of chart inside the dashboard designer. So yes, you can have a bubble chart, a pie chart, or a bar chart, line chart, etc.
In the ASP.NET world, can the data source for a chart be the grid out of the box?
So you can set the chart data source as the same data source as the grid, which would make more sense. One thing that you can do is you can bind a grid control to a pivot table, though, so that as you update the pivot table, the chart control is updated automatically. And there's a couple of examples on our YouTube channel where Julian and I have built something like that, I believe.
All right, let's see. What, and I don't know if this is too much, but what advantages does JavaScript offer over D3.js?
Ooh. Okay, D3.js, A is a JavaScript library and B is a charting library. It is it open source? I think it's open source. I personally have never used D3, so it's kind of hard for me to comment on where we're at with regard to it. D3 being open source means, yeah, you don't get any support at all, and yet with DevExtreme you do. If there is certain chart types that D3 supports that we don't, then obviously go for that. I mean, broad question, hard for me to answer.
Let's see. Are you planning on showing the report/charting portion? Is that planned for the near future? Maybe another webinar?
More than happy to do a presentation on charts inside reports.
Sounds like a plan, Stan.
And we did get a clarification on that 10 million. He says data will not be shown all at once but on scroll, but I don't want to modify the values. I asked this because without such an operation, max, average, etc., it becomes very slow.
Yeah, I'll agree. Problem with doing averages and max is you need all of the data downloaded onto the machine, doing the comparisons and doing the calculations and all the rest of it. It would be nice if you could just do it page by page. Well, I suppose you could do. I don't think there's anything in there that would help out. It's one of those.
You raise a support ticket.
Yeah.
Let's get the brains of the engineers behind it.
Yeah.
All right, that's all the questions.
Okay. Cool. Well, thanks everybody, and thank you to Paul, and thank you to Amanda, and we'll be back with some charts in reports, I think. I get that impression.
Absolutely. Well, and we'll also take some of the feedback and maybe do a more technical dive now that we've done the primer and then high-level one.
Sounds good. All right, everybody, like I mentioned before, today's webinar will be available later on our DevExpress YouTube channel. I posted the link to our channel in the chat box. We are always adding new webinar sessions. You can register for them at devexpress.com/webinars, and you can also see all of our past recorded webinars there as well. And that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Paul and Julian. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.